The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, carried by a dust-caked rider who dropped it at the door of the Sweetwater Ranch without so much as a word. And from that moment forward, nothing in Harlan Ellsworth's life would ever be the same again. He was 31 years old and had never learned to read a single word. That was simply the truth of him, plain and unadorned as the Wyoming sky above the Powder River Basin where he had worked cattle since he was 14. He had been raised by a father who believed that calluses were worth more than letters, that a man who could rope a steer and break a horse and read the weather in the color of the clouds had everything he needed to survive in a world that would sooner kill you than coddle you. Harlan had believed that too, right up until the moment old Burl Chadwick, the ranch foreman who had been with the Sweetwater operation for 20 years, handed him the envelope with his name written on the front in handwriting so careful and deliberate it looked like something from a church stained glass window. "It came from back east," Burl said, squinting at the envelope with the practiced suspicion of a man who had lived long enough to know that letters from back east rarely brought good news. "Kansas City, looks like. You know anybody in Kansas City, Harlan?" Harlan turned the envelope over in his hands. He could feel the weight of it, the slight stiffness of the paper inside, and he experienced a feeling he could not name, something low and warm and uncertain moving through his chest like the first rumble of a distant thunderstorm. "No," he said, "I don't know a soul in Kansas City." He tucked the letter into the breast pocket of his work shirt and went about his day, which meant riding the eastern fence line to check for breaks, helping drag 2 young steers out of a muddy section of creek bottom, and spending the better part of the afternoon arguing with a traveling merchant about the price of saddle leather. He did not think about the letter in the way that a man thinks deliberately about a thing. Instead, it simply sat against his chest like a coal that had not yet decided whether it was going to burn or go cold. That night after supper, when the other hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the fire in the ranch house kitchen had burned down to a low orange glow, Harlan sat at the plank table and set the letter in front of him. He opened the envelope very carefully, the way he'd seen men handle things they didn't want to break. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in that same careful handwriting, and he stared at it for a long time, recognizing letters here and there, the shapes of them familiar from years of squinting at wanted posters and trail signs without ever truly understanding them. But the words themselves remained locked behind a wall he had never once tried to climb. He felt something he was not accustomed to feeling, which was shame, deep and personal and sharp-edged. It was different from the shame of a missed rope throw or a horse that threw you in front of other men. This was quieter and more private. This letter, whatever it said, was written to him specifically. Somebody had sat down somewhere in Kansas City, Missouri, and thought about him enough to put ink to paper and form his name, and he could not honor that by understanding a single word of it. He folded it back up and put it in his pocket. The next morning he rode to town. Millhaven was not much of a town even by Wyoming territory standards, which themselves were not particularly demanding. There was a general store run by a man named Perkins who had asthma and strong opinions about tariff policy, a saloon called the Yellow Dog, a livery stable, a barber shop, a land office, and a small white church at the far end of the main street where Reverend Aldous Hicks preached every Sunday to a congregation of about 40 people, half of whom were only there because the Reverend's wife made the best coffee in the territory and served it after services. Harlan had never been inside the church for any purpose other than 2 funerals, one of which was for his own father, but he tied his horse at the post outside on that Wednesday morning and walked through the door with his hat in his hands. Reverend Hicks was at the altar arranging hymnals with the focused concentration of a man who took the placement of hymnals very seriously. "Harlan Ellsworth," the Reverend said, looking up with the mild surprise of a man who is genuinely pleased but careful not to show too much pleasure in case it was interpreted as eagerness. "What brings you in?" "I need somebody to read something for me," Harlan said. He hesitated. And I'd appreciate it staying between us. Reverend Hicks was a careful man who understood that secrets kept in confidence were among the most valuable things a minister could offer his community. He nodded once and held out his hand for the letter. The Reverend read it through twice without speaking. His expression changed as he read, moving through something that began as polite interest and arrived at something gentler and more complicated. When he finished, he looked up at Harlan with eyes that held an unusual quality of regard. "It's from a woman named Susan Lawson," the Reverend said. "She's a schoolteacher. She was in Kansas City until recently, and now she is in Cheyenne. She says she received your name from the Sweetwater Land and Cattle Company through an advertisement they placed in a Kansas City newspaper asking for persons of education and good character who might be interested in a position as a ranch school teacher. It seems the company wants someone to teach the children of the ranch families out in the basin." Harlan stared at him. "I didn't place any advertisement." "No," said the Reverend, looking at the letter again. "But it appears Mr. Whitmore did." "Your employer." Harlan was quiet for a moment, thinking about Clarence Whitmore, who owned the Sweetwater Ranch and about 7,000 acres of Wyoming territory surrounding it, and who had 3 daughters of his own ranging from 6 to 11 years of age, none of whom had seen the inside of a proper schoolroom in their lives. "What else does it say?" Harlan asked. "She says she has accepted the position and will arrive in Millhaven by stage on the 15th of May. She says she is writing ahead to ask if there is someone who might be able to tell her what to expect, as she has never been west of Missouri and is anxious to be properly prepared." The Reverend set the letter down carefully on the altar. "She writes very well, Harlan. She's clearly an educated woman." He paused. "She also says that she has heard the Wyoming territory is quite beautiful in the spring, and that she hopes to find it as lovely as people have described." Harlan took the letter back and looked at it again, at the careful loops of her handwriting. He could see now, knowing what he was looking at, that there was something in the formation of the letters that was both precise and somehow warm, the way a carefully made thing can still carry the warmth of the hands that made it. "She wrote to me specifically?" he asked. "She did, Mr. Whitmore apparently gave the advertisement company your name as the main contact for the ranch, since you're the ranch foreman now." Harlan folded the letter once more and stood with it in his hands. "She'll want an answer," he said. "I can write it for you," the Reverend offered. "No," Harlan said, and the word came out more firmly than he expected. He wasn't entirely sure why he said it. Some part of him, some quiet, determined part that lived below the level of conscious thought, had already decided something. "I appreciate it, Reverend, but I'll handle it myself." He rode back to the ranch in the long afternoon light, the letter in his pocket again and a new kind of weight in his chest, one that was different from the shame he had felt the night before. This weight had direction to it. It was pointed somewhere. He found Burl Chadwick sitting on the fence rail outside the North Corral, watching 2 horses argue about territory. "Burl," Harlan said, swinging down from his horse. "Mr. Whitmore hired a school teacher." Burl worked his jaw like he was thinking about whether to be surprised by this. "Well," he said, "that would explain why he had me clear out that old storeroom next to the main house last month. Thought he was just reorganizing." "When's she coming?" 15th of May. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "She wrote ahead to me." Burl slid a sidelong look at him with the long-practiced ease of a man who has spent enough years with another man to read weather in his face. And I need to write her back." Another long pause. The 2 horses had resolved their argument in favor of the larger one. "You need me to?" "No," Harlan said again. "I'm going to do it myself." Burl studied him for another moment and then turned back to the horses with the wisdom of a man who knows when something has been decided. "All right then," he said. What happened next was the quietest and most stubborn thing Harlan Ellsworth had ever done in a life that contained many quiet and stubborn things. He rode to town the following morning and went to the general store, where he bought a McGuffey's First Eclectic Reader, a primer for small children, a box of pencils, and a stack of lined writing paper. Perkins looked at him over the counter with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that some purchases were not to be commented upon, and Harlan was grateful for it. He began that same evening, alone at the kitchen table with a lantern burning close to the page, working through the alphabet as though he were learning to break a particularly difficult horse. He was methodical about it. He was not a man who did things carelessly. He sounded out letters with his mouth barely moving, conscious of the ridiculousness of a 31-year-old cowhand sitting at a table with a children's primer, and then he pushed that consciousness aside and kept going. He also went back to Reverend Hicks, who turned out to have patience that was essentially inexhaustible, and they met 3 mornings a week before the rest of the town was properly awake, sitting in the church pews with the primer and a copy of the Bible, working through words and sounds, and then sentences, and then the particular challenge of stringing sentences together into something that meant what you wanted it to mean. The Reverend was a good teacher. He never once made Harlan feel foolish, which was a gift of incalculable value. The 15th of May came, and Harlan was not ready. He went to meet the stage in Millhaven with a perfectly clean shirt and his best hat, and the knowledge that he had learned to read simple words, but could not yet write a response that would honor the woman who had sent him that letter. The stage arrived late, which they often did, rolling into Millhaven in a cloud of dust and noise that sent 2 dogs and a chicken scattering from the main street. Harlan stood beside his horse with his hat in his hands and watched the door of the stage open. Susan Lawson was 26 years old, and she stepped down from that stage like she had been stepping down from stages her whole life, which in a sense she had, having traveled from Kansas City to Cheyenne, and from Cheyenne to Millhaven with the deliberate and organized composure of a woman who had decided that being afraid of the unknown was simply not a productive use of her energy. She was not particularly tall, but she carried herself in a way that added inches to her bearing. Her dark hair was pinned neatly under a traveling hat that had survived the journey in better condition than any hat had a right to. Her eyes, when they found him in the small crowd that had gathered to see who was coming and going, were the particular shade of brown that made you think of creek water in autumn, deep and clear and moving. She had 2 bags and a trunk, and she looked around the main street of Millhaven with the expression of a woman who had prepared herself for something, and was now reconciling that preparation with the reality of the thing. "I'm looking for Harlan Ellsworth," she said to the small crowd in general, with a voice that was calm and clear and carried no apology in it. "That's me," Harlan said and stepped forward. She looked at him directly, the way people who had grown up being taken seriously had learned to look at people, with full attention and without flinching. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, "I'm Susan Lawson. I wrote to you." "I know," he said. "I got your letter." Something crossed her face, brief and unreadable. "I didn't receive a reply. I hope everything is in order with the position." "Everything's in order," he said. "The position is yours if you still want it. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you. I'll take you out to the ranch once you've had a chance to rest." She studied him for a moment with those clear brown eyes, and he had the odd sensation of being assessed not unkindly but very thoroughly, the way a capable person assesses a situation before deciding how to proceed within it. "I don't need to rest," she said. "I'm quite capable of traveling directly." He almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." He loaded her trunk into the wagon while she retrieved her bags, and they set out for the Sweetwater Ranch in the late afternoon light, driving northeast along the wagon road that cut through the basin with the Powder River visible to the east and the mountains sitting blue and enormous on the horizon. Harlan drove and Susan sat beside him on the wagon seat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving constantly over the landscape with an expression of concentrated attention. "It's very large," she said, after they had been driving for 20 minutes in silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was the kind of silence that 2 strangers maintain when they are each quietly deciding what to make of the other. "The country," he said. "Everything." She turned to look at him. "I grew up in Ohio. Moved to Kansas City 4 years ago. The largest open space I have ever seen was the Missouri River on a wide bend. This is something else entirely. It takes some getting used to, he said. Does it? She sounded genuinely curious, as though she was filing this information alongside other things she was learning and comparing it against her own current experience. Do you ever stop being amazed by it? He thought about that honestly. No, he said. I don't think I do. She nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had hoped to hear. Then she turned back to the landscape, and they drove on in silence that had shifted into something slightly warmer. The silence of two people who have established one small piece of common ground and are willing to stand on it together for a while. Clarence Whitmore met them at the ranch house, which was a substantial log structure with a wide porch and glass in the windows, the latter being something of a luxury out here that Whitmore had arranged because his wife had asked for it years ago, and he had spent the subsequent decade trying to prove that the asking had been worth his trouble. Whitmore was a heavy-set man of 52 with a gray mustache and the habit of shaking hands with both of his, which communicated a warmth that was genuine even when he was being businesslike. "Miss Lawson," he said, taking both her hands, "I am very glad you made it. Your reference letters from Kansas City were excellent. Excellent. We have been managing the children's schooling as best we can, but as best we can has not been particularly good, I'm afraid." "I'm happy to be here, Mr. Whitmore," Susan said. She was looking at the ranch with a professional interest, noting the layout of the outbuildings, the bunkhouse, the cleared area that had presumably been designated as the school space. "How many students will I have?" "7 at present, ranging from 5 to 12 years. 3 of my own daughters, 2 children belonging to my foreman here, and 2 from the Burrell-Chadwick family." Susan turned to look at Harlan. "I didn't know you had children," she said. There was a brief moment of confusion before Whitmore clarified, with the oblivious pleasantness of a man who doesn't notice awkwardness until it has fully ripened. "Harlan's the ranch foreman, Miss Lawson. The children I mentioned are from 2 of our other senior hands, the Garner brothers. They each have a youngster in need of schooling." "Of course," Susan said. Her expression had returned to its composed professional quality, but something had shifted behind her eyes, something small and quickly contained, like a candle flame touched by a draft. The room that had been prepared for her was the cleared storeroom adjacent to the main house, which had been fitted with a proper bed, a writing desk, a small stove for warmth, and shelves for her books. When Harlan carried her trunk inside and set it down, she walked around the room once with her hands clasped behind her, making that same inventory assessment she had applied to the landscape earlier. "It's fine," she said. "It's more than fine, actually. Thank you. There's water from the pump outside, and you can take meals with the family in the main house," he said. "Breakfast is at 6, supper at 7. I'll want to set up the school room first thing tomorrow," she said. "Mr. Whitmore mentioned the old hay barn near the East Corral has been designated as the schoolroom." "That's right. I can help you get it ready." She looked at him directly again. "Don't you have cattle to attend to, Mr. Ellsworth?" "I do," he said, "but I can spare a morning." Something moved across her face again, that same brief and unreadable thing. Then she smiled just slightly, the first real smile she had offered since stepping off the stage. It was not a large smile, but it changed everything about her expression. "Thank you," she said. "That's kind of you." He said good night and walked back to the bunkhouse, and sat on his bunk with his boots still on, thinking about the way she had looked at him when she smiled. And then he got up and took out his primer and worked until the lamp burned low. The schoolroom came together in 2 days. Harlan spent the first morning hauling in wood for benches and tables, which Burrell helped him cut and assemble with the practical competence of men who had been building things from raw materials their whole lives. Susan directed the layout with the authority of someone who had thought carefully about sight lines and light, and the particular way children needed to be positioned relative to a board and a teacher. She had brought books from Kansas City, packed carefully among her clothing, and she arranged them on a shelf near the front of the room with the precise attention of a woman who understood that books were tools as much as objects. On the second morning she was up before anyone else, and Harlan found her standing in the doorway of the finished schoolroom in the early light, looking at what they had built. He had come to check on a fence post near the east corral and had not intended to stop, but he stopped. "It's good," she said, without turning around. She had somehow known he was there, which he found both impressive and mildly unnerving. "You heard me coming," he said. "You have a distinctive walk," she said. "You favor your left slightly, old injury." He was quiet for a moment. "Horse fell on me 8 years ago," he said. "It doesn't trouble me much." She turned around then, and in the early morning light she looked different from the composed professional woman who had stepped off the stage. She looked younger and less arranged, her hair not yet fully pinned, her eyes clear and direct in the way they always were. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For what?" "I was curt with you when we arrived, when I asked about the children. I was tired from the journey and I was managing it poorly. That was not gracious of me." He shook his head. "You weren't curt. You were tired, there's a difference." She considered him for a moment. "You're more perceptive than I expected," she said, and then, as though she realized how that might sound, she added quickly, "That came out wrong." "No," he said, "it came out honest. Most people expect a ranch foreman to be straightforward about cattle and not much else." "And are you?" she asked. "Not always," he said. She smiled again, that same small smile that changed everything about her face, and this time it lasted a little longer. "I'll have the children begin on Monday," she said. "I hope they're ready." "I hope you are," he said, and meant it warmly, and she laughed, which was a sound he had not been prepared for, clear and genuine and slightly surprised, as though she had not expected to be amused by him. He walked back to his morning work with that sound settling somewhere inside him like a stone dropping into still water, sending rings outward through everything. The 6 months began to move like a river with a strong current, full of individual days that each had their own particular weather and quality of light. Susan threw herself into the work of teaching with the energy of someone who had found what they were made for. The 7 children, ranging from Whitmore's youngest daughter Clara at 5 years old to a quiet boy named Edgar Garner at 12, came to the schoolroom every weekday morning, and emerged from it changed in ways that their parents noticed first at the supper table, where suddenly children were asking questions that required real answers. Harlan continued his 3 mornings a week with Reverend Hicks, arriving in town before dawn and working through the growing complexity of reading and writing with the same methodical stubbornness he brought to everything difficult. His progress was real and measurable. He moved through simple sentences and into paragraphs. He learned to recognize words on sight without sounding them out. He began, haltingly and with enormous effort, to write. His handwriting was nothing like Susan's. It was large and uneven and functional, but it formed words that meant what he wanted them to mean, and there was something in that, in the act of making language with his own hand, that he had not expected to feel as significant as it did. He did not tell Susan. He was not entirely sure why, except that he had some instinct that, when he answered her letter, he wanted it to be with words that were properly formed and genuinely his own, and he was not there yet. In the meantime, he found other ways to be near her that did not involve pretending to be something he was not. He fixed the schoolroom stove when it started smoking. He brought extra firewood without being asked. When one of the Garner children told him that Miss Lawson had mentioned she would love to see the river up close but had not yet been, he arranged a Sunday afternoon ride to the Powder River with a small group from the ranch, and he watched her stand at the river's edge in the October wind with her face turned into it and her eyes wide and bright, and he thought that he had never in his life seen anyone look so completely present in a moment. She was not unaware of him. He knew that, though he could not have said precisely how he knew it. There were moments when she would look at him across the supper table with an expression that was careful and considering, the way she looked at things she was still making up her mind about. There were moments when she found reasons to speak with him beyond the purely practical, asking about the history of the basin or the nature of the work, or what the winter would be like, and staying in the conversation longer than the information strictly required. One evening in October, when the first cold had come in from the north and the mountains had taken on their snow caps, she found him in the corral working with a young mare that had been nervous about being saddled. He did not notice her at first, and she watched from the fence for several minutes without announcing herself. He was talking to the horse in a low, continuous voice, just talking, not coaxing exactly but explaining, the way you'd explain something to a person who was frightened and needed to understand what was happening to them, rather than simply be managed through it. When the mare finally accepted the saddle and stood still, he looked up and found Susan watching him with an expression he had not seen on her before. It was open in a way her expressions usually were not. "I didn't want to interrupt," she said. "You wouldn't have," he said. "How long were you standing there?" "A while." She climbed up onto the fence rail and sat on it with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had grown up around fences if not around horses. "Do you always talk to them?" "Always," he said. "They understand more than people think they do, not the words necessarily, but the intention behind them, whether you mean them harm or good." She was quiet for a moment. "I think people are like that too," she said. "More than we realize." He looked at her across the corral. The evening light was going orange and long across the grass, and it caught her hair and the line of her profile, and he was aware, in a way that was not abstract, of exactly what she meant to him. He had been aware of it for some time, in the way a person is aware of weather coming in, that low-pressure feeling before a storm, the knowledge of it without yet having to decide what to do about it. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "The work, the country." "The work is the best work I've ever done," she said. "These children are extraordinary, they're learning so quickly." She paused. "The country is something I don't have words for yet. I'm still accumulating the vocabulary for it." "You'll find it," he said. "You're good with words." She turned to look at him with something that was almost mischief. "You've never read anything I've written," she said. He held her gaze and did not look away. "No," he said, "I haven't." Something passed between them in that moment that was not said aloud. He was not sure exactly what she understood from his answer. But she did not look away either, and after a moment she smiled, smaller and more private than her other smiles, and climbed down from the fence rail and walked back toward the schoolroom. He stood in the corral with the young mare breathing quietly beside him and told himself he had 6 months. He had started in May. It was October. He was not finished. He worked harder. He began staying up later with the lamp, writing practice letters on the lined paper, writing sentences, and then crossing them out and writing better ones. He started keeping a small journal, not because he had any literary ambitions, but because writing daily, even about ordinary things, the weather, the cattle counts, the particular blue of the sky over the mountains, was the fastest way to make the mechanics of it natural. He also began to read. Not children's primers anymore, but actual newspapers when he could get them, and the almanac, and the land records in the county office that he had to review periodically as ranch foreman anyway, and had always previously handled through Burrell or Whitmore. He read them himself now slowly, in the privacy of the land office, working through the legal language with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. In November, a man named Dalton Reeves came through Millhaven and stayed for 2 weeks at the Yellow Dog Saloon. He was a land speculator from Denver with a good suit and an easy manner, and he made no secret of his interest in Susan Lawson, who was, as everyone in Millhaven and the surrounding basin had come to know, a beautiful and intelligent woman of 26 who was doing remarkable work with the ranch children, and who appeared, as far as anyone could tell, to be unattached. Harlan heard about Reeves's interest from Burrell, who heard it from one of the hands who drank at the Yellow Dog on Saturday nights. He sat with this information for 2 days without doing anything about it, And then one evening, he rode into town on the pretext of picking up the monthly supply order and found Dalton Reeves at the general store, talking to Susan with the practiced ease of a man who was accustomed to getting what he went after. Susan was civil and polite and entirely composed, answering Reeves's questions about Kansas City and the teaching position with the measured warmth she applied to everyone. And Reeves was leaning against the counter at an angle that communicated ownership of the space in a way that made Harlan's jaw tighten without his permission. He nodded at Susan and said good evening to Perkins and began loading the supply order with focused attention. "You're from the Sweetwater Ranch," Reeves said, turning to him with the easy curiosity of a man who includes everyone in his charm because it costs him nothing. "I am," Harlan said. "Fine operation, from what I hear. Whitmore's land holdings in this basin are substantial. I've been looking at some of the adjacent parcels myself, actually." Reeves said this with the careful casualness of someone whose primary interest was land and who wanted everyone to know it. "You the foreman?" "I am," Harlan said again. "Harlan manages the entire ranch operation," Susan said, and there was something in the way she said it, a small, precise emphasis that communicated a regard that was not casual. Reeves heard it too. Harlan could see it in the slight adjustment of the man's easy posture. "Well," Reeves said, "a man with responsibilities." He smiled at Susan. "I hope you'll let me call on you Sunday, Miss Lawson. I know of a very fine restaurant in Cheyenne I'd be delighted to take you to." "That's very kind," Susan said. "But I have lesson preparations on Sundays." Reeves accepted this graciously, the way men of his type accepted inconvenience, not as a final answer but as a temporary arrangement. He said his good evenings and went back to the saloon with the confident stride of a man who had not given up. Harlan finished loading the supply order. Susan stood nearby looking at the newspaper rack with an expression of polite disinterest in its contents. "You don't have to do lesson preparations on Sundays," Harlan said quietly. "I know," she said, equally quietly. He looked at her. She looked at the newspaper rack. The lamp in the general store burned warm and yellow above them. "He'll try again," Harlan said. "I expect he will," she said. She reached out and straightened one of the newspapers on the rack with a precise finger, aligning it with the others. People generally do when they decide they want something. He was not entirely sure whether she was still talking about Reeves. He was not entirely sure she wasn't. He picked up the loaded crate and said good night and drove back to the ranch in the cold November dark, thinking about the letter in his desk drawer that was still waiting for an answer. By December, he could read a newspaper end to end in one sitting. His writing had become steady and functional, still without elegance but with a growing certainty, the letters forming consistently and the sentences connecting in ways that said what he meant them to say. He wrote a draft of the letter. He read it back. He wrote it again. He wrote it 5 times, each version better than the last, each one more fully his own, less like a man trying to perform the act of writing and more like a man actually speaking on paper. The winter closed in around the Sweetwater Ranch in the way Wyoming winters do, completely and without apology, snow coming in thick from the north and the temperature dropping until the air had a quality of glass. The ranch contracted around itself, the hands spending more time near the fire and less time ranging out across the land. The school continued through the winter mornings, Susan arriving at the barn-turned schoolroom before the children with the fire already built and the slates chalked. She had become part of the fabric of the place in a way that was so natural that it was difficult to remember the ranch without her. She and Harlan fell into the habit of talking in the evenings. It was not by any explicit design. It simply happened the way some things happen, gradually and inevitably, born out of proximity and genuine interest, and the particular quality of long winter nights when the fire was bright and the wind was loud outside the walls. They sat in the main house kitchen after supper, sometimes with Burl and his wife Margaret and sometimes alone, and they talked about everything. She told him about Ohio and Kansas City, and the particular challenges of teaching in a city where children were more interested in the chaos of the street than the interior of a classroom. He told her about the cattle seasons and the particular character of different kinds of horses, and the way the basin looked in every weather, which was different every time. They told each other things they had not told other people. Not because they were trying to, but because the conversation kept going and kept deepening, and it turned out that both of them had a great deal that wanted to be said to someone who was actually interested. One evening in January, in the middle of a conversation about whether it was more difficult to teach a child who believed learning was unnecessary or a child who was afraid of failing, she looked at him across the kitchen table and said something that stayed with him. "You're the most thoughtful man I've met in a very long time," she said. "I mean that specifically. You think about things carefully before you say them. Most people don't." He was quiet for a moment. "I had a letter I needed to write," he said carefully. "It made me think about the difference between what you think and what you can actually put into words. How much gets lost in the translation?" She looked at him with focused attention. "What letter?" she asked. "Yours," he said. "The one you wrote when you arrived in Wyoming." She was still for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I sent that letter to the ranch contact name. I didn't know it was reaching you specifically." "It reached me specifically," he said. "I never got a reply," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't." He looked at the table for a moment, at the grain of the wood, and then he looked back at her. "I'm writing it." She absorbed this slowly with the deliberate intelligence she brought to everything. "You're writing it," she said. "The reply to the letter I sent in April." "Yes," he said. "It's January," she said. "I know," he said. She was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled between them. The wind moved against the outside walls. And then she asked, with the directness that was one of the most consistent things about her, "Why did it take so long?" He met her eyes, those clear brown eyes that were always paying full attention to whatever they were looking at. "Because I wanted to do it right," he said. "And I wasn't ready." She looked at him for another long moment. And then she nodded slowly, as though she had just understood something that had been at the edge of her comprehension for some time. "All right," she said. And they went back to talking, but something had shifted. Something had been placed on the table between them and left there, visible to both of them, and neither of them pretended it wasn't. February came in fierce and uncompromising, the worst stretch of the winter, with 3 days of blizzard that locked the ranch down completely and left snowdrifts against the south wall of the main house that were taller than a man. During those 3 days, everyone on the ranch was confined to close quarters, the hands rotating through the livestock checks in short, brutal shifts, and the children, thrilled by the suspension of routine, ran through the main house with a cheerful disregard for the adults' nerves. On the second day of the blizzard, Susan found Harlan in the small room off the main kitchen that he used as an office for the ranch accounts. He was sitting at the desk with his back to the door, writing, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard her. The look on his face when he turned around and saw her was not embarrassment, exactly. It was something more complicated and more exposed than that. On the desk before him was a page covered in his large, careful handwriting, and beside it was a stack of similar pages, and she could see that these were drafts of something, pages worked over and revised, the marks of effort visible in the crowded margins and crossed-out lines. She did not say anything immediately. She looked at him, and she looked at the pages on the desk, and she looked back at him, and he watched her put it together with the same clear-eyed intelligence that he had watched her apply to everything since the day she arrived. "You didn't know how to read," she said. It was not a question. It was the conclusion of a careful calculation, stated with precision and without judgment. "No," he said, "when I sent the letter." "No, you learned," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for another moment, and he held very still, because there are moments when everything depends on staying still and letting the other person reach the conclusion they are reaching without interruption. "You learned to read," she said again, quietly, as though she were testing the full weight and shape of the idea, "so that you could answer it yourself." "Yes," he said. She sat down in the chair across from him, the chair he sometimes used for going over maps of the property, and she folded her hands on the desk in front of her the way she did when she was thinking something through carefully. "How long did it take?" she asked. "I started the day after your letter arrived," he said, "in May." She looked at the stack of pages on his desk. "It was February. 9 months," she said. "I wasn't ready to write back until December," he said. "I've been working on the right version since then." She pressed her lips together and looked down at her folded hands and then back up at him with those eyes that were doing something he had not seen them do before, something that was bright and careful and slightly overwhelmed, as though she were managing a feeling that was larger than she had anticipated. "May I read it?" she asked. "When it's finished." "That's the point of it," he said. She looked at him for one more long moment, and then she stood up and smoothed her skirt and walked back out of the office with the composure of a woman who had decided to let the next thing happen when it was ready to happen, and not before. He finished the letter that night, sitting at the desk while the blizzard howled outside. He wrote the final version with the lamp turned up high and his hand moving steadily across the page, not pausing, not crossing out, not revising, just writing what he wanted to say in the words that were actually his own. When he finished, he read it back to himself once quietly, and it was what he had meant it to be. He folded it into an envelope and wrote her name on the front, and for a moment he simply looked at her name in his own handwriting, the first time he had ever written a person's name on an envelope. The blizzard broke on the third morning and the world outside the ranch was white and clean and silent, the mountains brilliant against the sky, the snow so deep in the basin that the cattle had to be broken out from where they'd sheltered against the southern fence. The entire ranch spent that day digging out. Every able-bodied person on the property involved in the sustained physical effort of clearing paths and checking on animals, and ensuring that nothing had been lost in the 3 days of storm. Harlan worked from before dawn until the light was going, and he did not find the moment to deliver the letter until the evening, when most of the hands had gone to bed early from exhaustion and the main house was quiet. He knocked on the door of Susan's room, the small attached room with the proper bed and the writing desk and the bookshelves. She answered after a moment, still dressed, a book in her hand, clearly not yet ready for bed herself. He held out the envelope. She looked at it and then at him and took it from his hand with both of hers, the way you take something you intend to handle carefully. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. He went back to the bunkhouse and lay on his bunk with his hands behind his head and listened to the enormous silence of the post-blizzard night. He slept eventually. In the morning, he was at the corral before 6, working through the usual morning routine, checking on the horses that had been confined during the storm, when he heard her boot steps on the frozen ground behind him and turned around. She was holding the envelope in both hands, and she looked like someone who had spent the night reading a single letter multiple times and was now standing in the morning light with what she had decided from it settled clearly in her expression. "I have to ask you something," she said. "All right," he said. "Did you learn to read because of the letter, because you needed to reply to it?" She stopped. "Or did you learn to read because of me?" He thought about this for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long. "Both," he said. "At the start it was the letter, but that was only ever the beginning of it." She looked at the envelope in her hands and then back at him. The early morning light was the color of pale gold, and it caught the frost on the fence posts and made everything sharp and clear and beautiful. "You said in the letter," she said, "that you hoped I had found the territory as lovely as people described. You said you hoped I was not disappointed." "I remember what I wrote," he said. "And then you said," she continued, and there was something in her voice that was very careful and very certain at the same time, "that you were not disappointed. That you found things here considerably better than you had expected." "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The frost on the ground caught the early light. The mountains were pink and gold above the basin. "I'm not disappointed either," she said, in case that was not clear. "It was not entirely clear," he said, "until this moment." She took one step closer to him, and he did not move because he did not want to misread a single moment of this, and she looked up at him with those clear brown eyes and said, "Harlan, I have been trying very hard to be professional and sensible about this for 9 months." "I know," he said. "It has been increasingly difficult," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I think," she said, "that if you would like to stop being quite so careful about misreading things, I would not object." He reached out and took her hands, both of them, envelope and all, and she let him, and the morning light was gold and cold and clear around them, and the mountain stood enormous and beautiful at the edge of the sky, and he said, "Susan." And she said, "Yes." And that was how it began. Spring came back to the basin with the gradual certainty of all real things, not arriving suddenly but accumulating. A warmer day here, a patch of clear ground there, the first green at the edges of the creek bottom, and the Powder River running high and cold with snowmelt from the mountains. The Sweetwater Ranch came back to life with the season, the work expanding outward again as the days lengthened, the cattle moving out to pasture, the fence checking and the branding and the long riding days that were the heart of the ranch's year. Harlan and Susan moved through all of it together, not always in the same place at the same time, because each of them had work that was genuinely their own, and they were both people who took their work seriously, but in the way that two people who have decided on each other exist in the same space, with a kind of awareness that does not require constant proximity to be constant. They rode together on Sunday afternoons when the teaching week was done, and the immediate ranch work had been managed. They rode out to different parts of the basin, and he showed her things, the particular section of the creek where the cottonwoods were thickest, and the light came through them at a certain hour in a way that made you stop your horse, the high ground to the north where you could see 80 miles of territory on a clear day, the place where he had found an eagle's nest 3 years running in the same dead pine. She told him about Ohio, about her mother who had been a fierce and determined woman who had decided that her daughter would be educated in a time when that decision required sustained argument with the world, about the school in Kansas City where she had taught for 4 years in conditions that were adequate but never quite what she had imagined teaching could be, about the feeling she had had when she saw the advertisement for the Wyoming position, which she described as the feeling of a door opening that you had not known was closed. He told her about his father, about the years of cattle work that had been his entire education in the things that mattered for survival, but had left a gap in him that he had never fully named until a letter arrived from Kansas City, and he could not read it. He told her about the mornings in the church with Reverend Hicks, about the primer for children that he had worked through at the kitchen table alone, about the particular difficulty and particular satisfaction of making language do what you needed it to do. She listened to all of it with full attention, the way she listened to everything, and when he finished she said, "That is one of the most remarkable things I have ever heard anyone do for any reason." "I had a very good reason," he said. They were on the high ground to the north, their horses standing still in the spring wind, 80 miles of Wyoming territory spread before them in every direction. She looked out at it and he looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. He had been thinking about how to say this for several weeks, and he had decided that the direct way was the right way, which was consistent with everything he knew about her and everything he knew about himself. "And I want to ask it properly because I've been learning that things said properly have a different weight than things said carelessly." She turned to look at him on her horse, those eyes steady and clear in the spring light. "I know that you came here for a position," he said, "and I know that position is yours regardless of anything I say now. I want that clear first." "It's clear," she said. "And I know that you're a woman who has her own life and her own work and her own decisions to make about what she wants, and I'm not asking you to give any of that up," he said. "I understand," she said. "I'm asking," he said, "if you would consider marrying me. Because I would rather build the rest of my life alongside yours than try to imagine it any other way, and I think we would be genuinely good for each other, and I think we would be happy, and I believe you might think so too, but I could be wrong." She looked at him for a long time with an expression he could not read the way he usually could read her expressions, which made him realize his heart was beating harder than he had noticed. "You're not wrong," she said. "And yes." The wedding happened in June, performed by Reverend Hicks in the small white church at the end of Millhaven's Main Street, with a congregation that amounted to most of the population of the surrounding basin, because the story of the Sweetwater Ranch schoolteacher and the ranch foreman who had taught himself to read and write in order to answer her letter had become the kind of story that travels fast in a country where there is genuine news and there is story. And this was story of the finest kind. Susan wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she ordered from Cheyenne, a deep blue that matched the particular quality of the Wyoming sky on a clear day, which was the color she had decided the first week she arrived that she wanted to wear when this moment came, though she had not told anyone that at the time. Harlan wore his good suit, which had been pressed by Margaret Chadwick with an iron, and a dedication that communicated everything Margaret felt about both of them. Burl Chadwick stood up beside Harlan with the stoic emotion of a man who was genuinely moved and determined not to let it show too obviously. Two of Susan's fellow teachers from Kansas City had made the journey west, because when she had written to them about what was happening, they had determined that they were going regardless of the inconvenience, and they sat in the front pew with wet eyes that they were less concerned than Burl about hiding. Reverend Hicks performed the ceremony with the unhurried gravity and warmth that were his particular gifts, and when he reached the moment of the vows, he paused and looked at Harlan with a private quality of regard, because Reverend Hicks knew better than anyone in that room what it had cost Harlan Ellsworth to stand here, and what it had built in him, and what it meant. Harlan said his vows in the clear, steady voice of a man who had learned that words meant what you put into them, and that you had to choose them for what you meant to say. And when he finished, Susan was looking at him with that open expression he had first seen in October at the corral fence, when she had watched him with the young mare, and it was the same as it had been then, unguarded and entirely honest. She said her vows back to him with the clarity and conviction that were the most consistent things about her, and when it was done, they were married in the white church in the Wyoming summer light, with the basin stretching out around them in every direction, and the mountains enormous and beautiful at the edge of everything. The reception was held at the Sweetwater Ranch, where Whitmore had arranged for enough food to feed a considerable army, partly because he was genuinely happy about the marriage, and partly because he was constitutionally unable to do anything modestly. There was music from a fiddle player, and a man with a mouth harp who had ridden in from 2 counties away specifically for the occasion. The children from the schoolroom ran through the gathering with the uncontained energy of children who understood that this was a party but not all of the reasons for it, which made them purely happy in a way that adults, who understood the reasons, could only approach. Edgar Garner, the quiet 12-year-old boy who had been in the schoolroom since the beginning, found Harlan near the fence line in the early evening when the party was in full swing and the fiddle was bright and the lanterns were lit against the coming dark. "Mr. Ellsworth," he said, with the formal precision of a boy who had been practicing what he wanted to say. "Miss Lawson, I mean Mrs. Ellsworth, she's the best teacher I ever had. She's the only teacher I ever had, actually, but I think she's the best one anyway." Harlan looked at him. "I think you're right," he said. "I'm going to learn everything she can teach me," Edgar said, with the particular determination of someone who has discovered that learning is not the torture they had been led to believe it might be. "Everything." "I'd do that," Harlan said, "if I were you." Edgar nodded with great seriousness and went back to the party. Harlan stood at the fence for a moment and looked at his wife, who was dancing with Whitmore's youngest daughter Clara, the 5-year-old, who had taken hold of Susan's hands and was spinning in a circle with the dedicated energy of a small person who has identified exactly what she wants to do at this moment and is doing it. Susan was laughing, clear and genuine and surprised, the way she had laughed that first morning when he had said he hoped she was ready. He thought about the letter, the original one, the one she had sent from Kansas City to the Sweetwater Ranch contact name without knowing who she was sending it to. He had kept it. It was in his desk drawer in the ranch office, and he intended to keep it there for the rest of his life, because it was the beginning of everything, and beginnings deserve to be kept. He walked back into the party, and his wife found him through the crowd with her eyes the way she always did and smiled across the space between them, and he smiled back. The first year of their marriage had a particular quality that Harlan would think of later as the year of learning how to be two people who are also still themselves, which turned out to be one of the more interesting educational projects either of them had undertaken. They were in some ways very different. She was by nature more organized in her thinking, more inclined to examine a situation from multiple angles before acting. He was more instinctive, more likely to read a situation in the moment and respond to what it was rather than what it might be. These differences, which might have been sources of friction, turned out instead to be complementary in the way that two different kinds of knowledge about the same subject can fill in each other's gaps. She kept teaching. This was never in question. Whitmore had been prepared to renegotiate the position entirely when the marriage happened, given the conventions of the time that expected a married woman to abandon professional work in favor of domestic life. But Susan had simply said, with complete composure, that she had a contract and intended to honor it, and that the children needed a teacher, and that she saw no reason why being married should prevent her from doing the work she had been hired to do. Whitmore, who had a practical man's instincts about what worked and what did not, and who had watched his daughters change under Susan's teaching in ways that were entirely good, agreed without significant argument. The number of students in the schoolroom grew as the basin became more settled, families arriving from the east through the late 1870s and into the 1880s with children who needed educating, and Susan expanded the school to accommodate them, working with Whitmore on the construction of a proper schoolhouse that summer, a real one with plank walls and a proper blackboard and benches that were the right height for children rather than adapted from adult furniture. Harlan became deeply involved in the construction of the schoolhouse, in the way that a man who cares about something takes on any practical challenge that needs doing. He spent 3 weeks of evenings and spare hours on it, working with the same methodical precision he brought to all physical work, and when it was finished, Susan walked through it and ran her hand along the smooth surface of the new blackboard and said quietly that it was perfect, and he knew she meant it. In the winter of 1879, almost exactly a year after the blizzard that had locked the ranch down for 3 days and changed everything between them, Susan told him she was going to have a child. He heard this piece of information and held it for a moment in that way. He held things that were too significant to rush past. Then he crossed the kitchen to where she was standing and put his hands on her face and looked at her. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you frightened?" "I am well," she said, "and I am a little frightened, but I am more happy than frightened." "Then I am too," he said. Their son was born in August of 1880 in the room that had been Susan's when she arrived and was now theirs together, attended by Margaret Chadwick, who had performed this service for more women in the basin than anyone had thought to count. He was a large and noisy baby with his mother's direct eyes and his father's stubborn quality of attention, and they named him Thomas because it was a solid name that did not make promises it could not keep. He was 3 weeks old when Harlan sat at the desk in the ranch office and wrote Susan a letter. Not a reply to anything. Just a letter to her, because he had learned that putting things in words gave them a weight and permanence that speech sometimes could not, and he had things he wanted to have that weight and permanence. He wrote about the morning Thomas was born and what it had felt like to hold him for the first time, and he wrote about the first letter she had sent, the one that had been the beginning of everything, and he wrote about what it had meant to learn to read and write, and how the learning had changed him in ways that went beyond the practical, how it had opened something in him that he had not known was closed, in the same way she had described Wyoming territory opening a door she had not known was closed. He wrote about what he felt for her, specifically and without abstraction, in the careful, direct language of a man who had learned to choose his words for what he meant them to say. He left the letter on her desk where she would find it. She found it that evening and read it at the desk, while Thomas slept in the cradle they had made together from a wooden barrel and a piece of soft wool blanket. And when she finished, she sat quietly for a moment, and then she took out her own paper and pen and wrote back. Her letter was 3 pages. It was everything she had been thinking and feeling since she stepped off the stage in Millhaven 3 years ago, and found a man standing beside a wagon with his hat in his hands, who was more than she had expected in every way. She wrote with the clarity and precision and warmth that had always been in her handwriting, and when she finished, she put it on his desk in the ranch office where he would find it in the morning. He found it and read it twice, slowly, taking his time with each sentence, the way he had learned to take his time with things that deserved it. When he finished, he sat for a moment with the letter in his hands and thought about the vast distance between the man who had sat at the kitchen table in May of 1878 with a children's primer and a lamp turned up too high, sounding out letters with his mouth barely moving, and the man sitting here now, reading his wife's letter on a summer morning in their ranch office with their son sleeping in the next room. That distance was not made of years, exactly. It was made of effort and stubbornness, and one stubborn, specific determination, to be worthy of a letter that a woman he had never met had taken the time to write carefully and send in good faith into a country she did not know yet. He folded her letter and put it in the desk drawer beside the original one, the one from Kansas City that had started everything. Life on the Sweetwater Ranch continued with the deep rhythm of a place that had found its proper character. The seasons turned. The cattle work went on in its essential and demanding way. The schoolhouse filled with more children as the basin settled and grew, families establishing themselves on the land that stretched endlessly north and west toward the mountains. Susan's teaching reputation spread beyond the immediate basin. She received a letter from the Wyoming territorial authorities in 1881 expressing interest in her methods and asking if she might be willing to train other teachers in the basin's growing school system. She replied that she would be delighted to, which led to 2 new teachers arriving in the valley the following spring, both of whom spent their first month in Susan's schoolhouse learning how she did it before being placed in newly established schools in neighboring communities. Harlan continued to read. This was simply part of his life now. He read the Cheyenne newspaper when it came, which was irregular but enthusiastic. He read the land records and the cattle reports and the correspondence that came to the ranch from the cattle company. He read books that Susan brought from Cheyenne on her quarterly supply trips, working through them in the evenings after Thomas was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp and a cup of coffee, his reading now as natural and unremarkable as any other thing he did with his hands. He also began, quietly and without making a project of it, to teach some of the ranch hands who could not read. There were 3 of them. He approached each one separately and privately, the way Reverend Hicks had approached him, with patience and without judgment, and they worked through it together. These men who had lived their whole lives managing without written language, and who, with a combination of effort and stubbornness that Harlan recognized intimately, discovered that they were not too old and the task was not impossible. One of them, a quiet Mexican cowhand named Ignacio, who had been with the Sweetwater operation for 4 years, and was one of the best horsemen Harlan had ever known, told him after his 3rd lesson that he had written his name for the first time, and it had felt like standing up from under a weight he had not known he was carrying. Harlan said he understood completely. In 1883, their 2nd child was born, a daughter they named Rosa, for Susan's grandmother in Ohio, who had sent them a wedding gift and letters since, and had become a warm and particular presence in their lives through correspondence alone. Rosa arrived in the world with less noise than Thomas had, but with no less determination, a quality that became evident within her first weeks and did not diminish as she grew. By the time she was 2, she had appointed herself an authority on the movements of everyone in the household, keeping close track of who went where and expressing clear opinions about the propriety of their decisions. Harlan and Susan sat on the porch of the main house one evening that autumn, Thomas playing in the yard with his particular focused attention to the project of building something from sticks that kept collapsing in ways he found genuinely interesting rather than discouraging. Rosa asleep inside after an afternoon that had required her full administrative capabilities. The air was cooling fast toward winter, and the mountains at the edge of the basin were going their deep evening blue. "Do you think about Ohio?" he asked her. It was a question he had asked before at intervals because he wanted to know honestly and because he was aware that she had given up something specific in coming west and that it was important to ask. "Sometimes," she said, "I think about my mother. I wish she could see this." She gestured toward the yard, the house, the mountains. "I wish she could see Thomas and Rosa." "I'm sorry she can't," he said. Susan's mother had died the previous winter, word arriving by letter that took 2 weeks to cross the distance, which was one of the specific sorrows of living in a new country. Susan had taken the news with the composed grief of a woman who has learned to hold large feelings with both hands and let them be what they are without being destroyed by them. "She would have liked you," Susan said. "She had no patience for men who were not serious about things. She would have respected the learning." "The learning was entirely self-interested," he said. "The most important kind," she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she did when she was tired in a particular comfortable way rather than an exhausted way. He put his arm around her. Thomas had given up on the collapsing stick structure and was now lying on his back in the grass looking at the sky with the deep concentration of a 4-year-old engaged with the mystery of clouds. "I want you to know something," Harlan said. He had been thinking about it for a while, and this felt like the right moment, though he was not sure why exactly. "Everything I have done in the last 5 years that I'm proud of, everything that matters in it, started with that letter. With deciding I was going to answer it properly." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. "Everything," she said. "Learning to read," he said. "Learning to put words together and mean them. Learning to teach Ignacio and the others. All of it. It started with not wanting to hand your letter to someone else and say, 'Tell me what this says.' It started with something in me that decided your letter deserved better than that." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those eyes that were always paying full attention to whatever they were looking at. "Your letter was perfectly decent," she said, "but it was essentially a professional inquiry about living conditions in Wyoming territory." "I know," he said. "That's not what I mean. It wasn't about the contents. It was about the fact that you had taken the time to write it at all, to me specifically. To a person you didn't know who might have been anyone. You wrote it assuming that whoever received it was worth writing to properly, and I did not want to be someone who wasn't." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she turned back to the yard and Thomas lying in the grass and the mountains going blue at the edge of everything, and she said, "I'm glad I wrote it." "So am I," he said. "Every day." The years that followed the autumn of 1883 carried all the expected and unexpected things of a life fully lived. There were hard winters and good summers, years when the cattle prices were strong and years when they weren't. There were seasons of ordinary difficulty, a fence line lost to a flash flood, a disease moving through part of the herd, a long dry summer that made the pasture poor. Harlan managed all of it with the steady competence of a man who had been doing this work for 20 years, and who had, additionally, the particular advantage of a wife who was genuinely his equal, and who was not shy about contributing her thinking to problems that needed good thinking applied to them. The school grew. By 1885, Susan had 2 assistant teachers working under her, both of them young women she had trained herself, and the schoolhouse that Harlan and Whitmore had built had been expanded twice. There were 30 children in regular attendance. 3 of the first students, including Edgar Garner, had gone on to further schooling in Cheyenne, something that had been made possible in part by Susan's own recommendations, and in part by the fact that she had spent years writing letters on their behalf to every institution in the territory she thought might be persuaded to see what she saw in these children from the basin. Edgar Garner sent her a letter from Cheyenne in 1886, informing her that he had passed his examinations and been accepted into a law reading program with an attorney there. He thanked her in terms that were careful and specific and clearly written by someone who had been well taught to value precision. She read the letter at the supper table with Thomas and Rosa listening, because she believed that letters of this kind deserved an audience. And then she set it down and was quiet for a moment with an expression that Thomas later described, accurately, as the one she made when she was very happy and was deciding not to cry about it. Thomas Ellsworth, at 6 years old, was much like his father in the specific quality of his attention, in the way he applied himself to things he cared about with an intensity that was not performative but simply genuine, and he had his mother's directness and precision with words. He was reading by the time he was 5, not because he was pushed, but because he was surrounded by books and by 2 people for whom reading was simply part of the texture of life. He read the way he breathed, without thinking about it, which was the greatest gift either of his parents had arranged for him, and neither of them had explicitly planned. Rosa at 3 was her own particular creature, with a will and a vocabulary that exceeded her years by a comfortable margin. She wanted to know the name of everything and the reason for everything, and she was not satisfied by incomplete answers. She had begun insisting on accompanying her father on his morning rounds of the ranch, with the single-mindedness of a person who has identified exactly what she wants to do and is waiting patiently for the adults around her to accept this. He began taking her with him. She rode in front of him on his horse, perfectly happy and extremely observant, commenting on everything she saw with the running commentary of a small person for whom the whole world is new and therefore fully worth discussing. He answered every question she asked, because she was like her mother in always asking questions that deserved real answers, and this became one of the fixed and cherished realities of his days. One morning, in the spring of 1887, he was riding the eastern fence line with Rosa in front of him, the 2 of them working through a detailed discussion of why the sky was blue, which Rosa had asked about, and which required him to try to explain something he did not fully understand himself, but was willing to attempt in good faith, when he saw Susan riding toward them from the direction of the ranch house on the bay mare she preferred for distance riding. She came up beside them, and Rosa immediately transferred the sky question to her mother, who took it on with the professional calm of a woman accustomed to questions she would have to think about carefully. While Susan was explaining light and atmosphere in terms that a 3-year-old could partially understand and find satisfying, Harlan watched her and thought about May of 1878, about a letter he could not read, and a decision he had made at a kitchen table by lamplight. He thought about the way a single determined decision can change the entire direction of a life. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a river is changed by a shifted rock, gradually and thoroughly, and in a direction you could never have anticipated from the point of the original change. He thought about the Reverend and the primers and the quiet hours of effort and the letter written and rewritten, until it was finally right, written in his own hand because anything less would have been a kind of dishonesty about who he was. He thought about the morning he had given her the envelope with her name on the front in his own large, careful handwriting, and the morning after that when she had come to find him at the corral fence with the answer to everything in her eyes. Susan finished her explanation of the sky. Rosa considered it with the grave attention of a person weighing information. "But why is it blue and not green?" Rosa said. "That is a very good question," Susan said, and caught Harlan's eye over their daughter's head and smiled. And he smiled back, and they rode back toward the ranch together in the spring morning light, Rosa asking questions all the way, the mountains enormous and beautiful above them, the basin spread out wide and green and endlessly generous around them, and the whole long good life they had built together continuing forward into a future that stretched as far as the eye could see from the high ground to the north, which was as far as the eye needed to see. That evening, after supper, after Thomas had gone to sleep in his room with a book he was halfway through about the history of horses, which was his current consuming interest, and after Rosa had been persuaded by degrees and negotiation that sleeping was a reasonable activity for a person of her age and energy, Harlan and Susan sat at the kitchen table, as they had done thousands of times in the years since the winter of 1879, with the lamp and the quiet of the late evening. Susan was writing a letter to one of her Kansas City friends. He was reading a copy of the Cheyenne paper that was 2 weeks old but contained a long article about the territorial government's plans for the school system that he wanted to understand fully before their next conversation about it. After a while, Susan finished her letter and folded it and set it aside and looked across the table at him. "I have been thinking," she said, "about next year." "What about it?" he asked, looking up. "I want to expand the school again. I want to add an upper section for students who have moved past the basic curriculum. Edgar is not the only student who has that potential, and I don't want to lose them to the idea that there is nothing further for them here." "All right," he said. "What do you need?" "Another room," she said, "and possibly another teacher, someone who can handle the advanced mathematics and natural science. I can do the literature and history and writing, but the mathematics, I'll talk to Whitmore about the room," he said, "and I'll write to Cheyenne about the teacher situation. There's a program there for training. I know about the program," she said. "I helped establish it." He looked at her. She looked at him with the particular expression that appeared when she was being precise about something and also slightly amused at herself for it. "Right," he said. "Then you should write to the program directly. You'll know exactly who to ask for." "I'll write tomorrow," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to his newspaper. And that was how they were, in the way of two people who have built something real together and know its value and tend to it with the same care they brought to everything, directly, thoughtfully, without ceremony, and with the quiet confidence of people who are exactly where they intended to be. The letter from May of 1878 stayed in the desk drawer in the ranch office, alongside the final version of Harlan's reply that had never been mailed because there had been no need to mail it, and alongside Susan's 3-page letter from the summer of 1880, and alongside the letters that had accumulated since from the various people in their lives whom they loved, and who loved them back across the distances of a large country. These papers, taken together, were the record of everything that mattered, and they were kept together in the same drawer with the same care that people keep the things they understand to be irreplaceable. Harlan had a habit, one that had begun without his deciding to begin it, and that had simply become part of the structure of his days, of stopping in the ranch office before he went to the corral in the morning and reading something. A page of a book, a few paragraphs of a newspaper, sometimes just a few lines of something he had written himself, the journal he had been keeping since the beginning, which was now 3 volumes filled with his large, steady handwriting. He had been told once, by a traveler passing through who had spent an evening at the Sweetwater Ranch and who had been a teacher himself before circumstances had redirected him, that the habit of daily reading changed the structure of the mind over time, made it more capable of holding complexity and sitting with ambiguity and connecting things that seemed unconnected. Harlan had thought about this for several days after the traveler had gone, and had decided that he did not know enough about the structure of minds to evaluate whether this was true, but that it matched something he had observed in himself without having found a way to articulate it. What he knew for certain was this, that learning to read had not been the end of anything. It had not been the completion of a task he had undertaken for a specific purpose. It had been the beginning of a different way of being in the world, one where the things that people had thought and felt and understood in every age and every place were accessible to him in a way they had never been before, and where his own thoughts and feelings and understandings could be set down in words and kept and given to other people, including the people he loved most, including his wife who had taught 30 children to read and write in the Wyoming basin, and who had built a schoolhouse and trained teachers, and changed the future of families in ways that would take generations to fully understand. In 1889, Wyoming became a state. They heard about it in Millhaven with the rest of the territory, the news arriving by wire and spreading outward with the speed that news always found in places where it was genuinely waited for. There were celebrations in town, a proper gathering with speeches, and a bonfire in the main street that brought people in from across the basin. Wyoming was the first state in the United States to have granted women the right to vote, a fact that had been true since territorial days in 1869, 20 years prior, and that Susan had always noted with a particular satisfaction when it came up, which it did sometimes when visitors from other parts of the country expressed surprise. She voted in the territorial elections. She had always voted. Harlan voted beside her. Thomas, who was 9 by 1889, asked his mother to explain exactly how voting worked and what it meant and why it mattered, and she sat him down at the kitchen table and explained it with the same complete seriousness she brought to everything her students asked her, because she believed that the question of how a society governed itself was among the most important questions a person could ask, and she would not give it a smaller answer than it deserved. The injustice of the broader world was not invisible to either of them. They lived in a territory, and then a state that was better in some ways than many places in the country. But the native peoples of the region had been steadily displaced by the decades of settlement and treaty breaking that were the undeniable underside of the same westward expansion that had brought Susan here, and that had built the Sweetwater Ranch on land that had been somebody else's before it was anybody's. Harlan had grown up in this country without thinking about this very much, the way people grow up inside the inherited assumptions of their world without examining them until something or someone makes them. Susan, who had examined assumptions systematically as part of her nature, raised it directly in the years of their marriage, not accusatorially but with the honest intellectual rigor she brought to every difficult subject. They talked about it, which was more than most people around them did, and it did not resolve neatly because these things do not resolve neatly, but the talking was real, and it changed the quality of how he understood the place he had lived his whole life, and he believed that was right and necessary even when it was uncomfortable. He taught Ignacio and the other hands to read. He made sure, quietly and without fanfare, that the children of the Mexican hands who worked at the Sweetwater Ranch had access to the schoolhouse as equal students alongside the children of the white ranch families. This required one conversation with Whitmore and no further argument, partly because Whitmore was a practical man who understood that an educated workforce was a better workforce, and partly because Susan had made the same point to him 3 months earlier in more philosophical terms and had laid the groundwork thoroughly. In the autumn of 1891, Harlan and Susan rode to the high ground to the north on a clear October afternoon, the last warm days of the season, the basin below them going gold and amber with the turning grasses, and the cottonwoods orange along the creek lines. They had done this at intervals since the spring of 1879, returning to this particular piece of high ground, the way people return to places that have been significant to them, not because anything is owed to the place itself, but because the act of return is its own kind of continuance. Thomas was 11 now and Rosa was 8, and they had left both children in the capable care of Margaret Chadwick, who had become in the years of their marriage a fixture of their lives as permanent and valued as the ranch house itself. They sat on their horses for a while without speaking, looking at the 80 miles of country that spread out before them in every direction. "I've been thinking about the letter again," Susan said, eventually. "Which one?" he said. "The first one," she said. "The one I sent before I knew anything about this place or you." "What about it?" he asked. "I was thinking about how little I knew when I wrote it. I was thinking about all the things I was asking without knowing I was asking them. I thought I was asking about teaching conditions and living arrangements, but what I was actually asking was whether this place was real, whether it could hold the kind of life I wanted." She paused. "And I was asking you specifically, though I didn't know it was you, whether there was someone there worth finding." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "I'm glad you asked," he said. "I'm glad you answered," she said. The sun was moving toward the western range, going orange and gold at the edges, the shadows stretching long across the basin. The horses stood still in the way horses stand when they are content and the day has been good. "Do you know what I think about?" he said. "More than anything else when I think about those first months." "What?" she said. "The way the primer felt in my hands," he said. "That first night, the specific texture of it. A book for children, and I was sitting at a table by myself with a lamp turned up high, 31 years old, working through the alphabet." He paused. "I have never once felt foolish about it. Not then and not now, because I knew exactly why I was doing it." She looked at him, and her eyes in the October light were clear and deep and exactly as they had always been, the creek water and autumn quality of them that had been one of the first things he had noticed and that he had never stopped noticing, because some things do not become less vivid for being familiar. "You have never once in all the years I have known you," she said, "done anything less than completely honestly. I learned that from you," he said, "from the way you put things." "From a letter asking about room and board arrangements," she said, with that slightly amused precision. "From the care behind it," he said. She reached across the space between their horses and put her hand over his where it rested on the saddle horn. The straightforward, natural gesture of two people who have been touching each other's hands for 13 years and who still find the act fully meaningful. They rode back down from the high ground toward the ranch in the last of the afternoon light, side by side down the long slope, the basin coming to meet them with all its familiar beauty, and the house visible in the distance with the lamp already lit in the kitchen window, because Thomas had been trusted to light it at dusk, and he was a boy who could be trusted. The kitchen was warm when they came in, Thomas at the table with his book, and Rosa at the counter helping Margaret Chadwick with something that had generated a considerable amount of flour on the surface, and on Rosa's apron, and on the tip of Rosa's nose. A fact that Rosa was apparently unaware of, and that gave her an expression of grave concentration that was undermined entirely by the dusting of white. Susan took off her hat and riding gloves at the door, and Harlan hung his coat on the peg beside hers where it had always hung, and Thomas looked up from his book long enough to confirm that his parents had returned from wherever they had gone, which was sufficient information. And Rosa said something about what they were making that Harlan did not quite catch, because she was talking to Margaret while simultaneously mixing something with great enthusiasm. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of it, the warm room and the lamplight and the flour-dusted daughter and the absorbed son, and his wife moving into the kitchen, with the particular ease of a woman who is completely at home in the place she has built, pulling her dark hair loose from the pins with one hand and reaching for the apron hook with the other. He had a thought that was not new, but arrived with the full weight of something newly understood. Everything he was standing in the doorway looking at had been in some essential way shaped by a decision made at a kitchen table alone in the lamplight, working through the alphabet like a man learning to walk, for the purpose of answering a letter from a woman he had not yet met but who had, in writing carefully and in good faith to a person she did not know, done him the considerable honor of assuming he was worth writing to. He had spent 6 months learning to read so that he could answer her letter himself. He had spent 13 years learning that answering it was the beginning and not the end. Rosa turned from the counter and saw him in the doorway and said, with the authority of a person who has just remembered an important piece of administrative information, "Papa, there is a letter on your desk from Mr. Garner in Cheyenne. Thomas brought it in from the post rider." "Thank you," he said. "It looked important," Rosa added, in the tone of someone who has assessed the situation thoroughly. "I'll read it after supper," he said. He came fully into the kitchen and shut the door behind him against the October evening. Susan looked up from where she was, and he looked at her, and that was enough, as it had always been enough, as it would always be enough. The two of them in the same room, in the life they had built from one careful letter and one stubborn decision, and all the ordinary and extraordinary days that had followed from both, stretching outward in every direction like the basin itself, wide and generous and endlessly good.